today's topic is genetics. And so we're going to start looking at how you inherit traits from your parents. And so if you take a look at the picture, kind of funny, dad's got horizontal stripes, mom's got vertical stripes. So the kid is a combination of the two parents. So if you check out the kid's shirt, it's checked. So a little genetics humor for you. Our I can statements. I can define the key genetics terms, and I'll be upfront and honest with you, there is a lot of vocabulary that's going to go with this unit, and we'll just keep practicing it with Quizlets. If you're here at school, we do Quizlet Lives almost every day to help you. So if you're at home and you're e-learning, it really is going to benefit you to do Quizlets, either the matching, use the flashcards, take the test each day, and just that repetition with those words, using those words over and over again is going to be key for you. Complete and interpret Punnett squares. So we're going to be starting that a little bit today, introducing what a Punnett square is. And then tomorrow we'll really start practicing how to complete and interpret a Punnett square. And then to look at all the possible outcomes of a genetic cross. So that means like if you have two parents and they cross those genes, and then it's going to show you what are all the possibilities for offspring and inheriting traits. We're going to start out talking about a scientist named Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was a monk who lived in a monastery in Europe in what's now the Czech Republic. Gregor Mendel was a teacher at a local high school. A monk is kind of like, it's almost like a male nun. So he had devoted his life to the Catholic Church. He lived in the monastery, and he taught biology and science at the local high school. He is many times called the father of genetics because he is the first scientist to really understand and do experimentation with genetics. He is the first person to come up with the terms dominant and recessive, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Gregor Mendel is famous for conducting experiments with pea plants. So on the grounds of the monastery where he lived, they had a big garden, and Mendel did a lot of experimenting with pea plants. And a lot of what he found out about genetics, he determined through these experiments that he did on the pea plants. So in his pea plant experiments, he used pea plants for a couple of reasons. One, the pea plants grew very quickly, so he was able to plant the seed and it grew, and he could see the different traits. Pea plants also had lots of different physical characteristics. For example, some of the plants were tall, some were short. Some had round seeds and some had wrinkled seeds. Some had inflated puffy pods, and some had like constricted pods, or it looked like they were kind of all the air was sucked out of them. Some of the casings on the seeds were gray, and some were white. The flowers were purple or white. So there were a lot of different characteristics that he could use to determine how those traits or characteristics were passed from the parent plant to the offspring. The plants got different traits from their parents. So it's kind of weird to think about there being parents in the plants, but plants that flower, that have a flower, they reproduce sexually. Those kids that have been here in school, we've talked about this a little bit. If you look into the flower, excuse me, you're going to see a big structure in the middle called the pistil, and that's the female reproductive structure. And on the end of the pistil is a sticky area called the stigma. Around the pistil are a little bit shorter little structures called stamens, and those are the male reproductive structures. On the end of the stamen, there's a little piece that kind of hangs down, almost like a little teardrop, called the anther. And on that anther are little grains of pollen, and you'll see them as yellow or orange kind of color. And the pollen contains sperm cells. So pollen has the sperm in it. What happens when flowers get pollinated is that pollen that has the sperm goes and gets stuck on the sticky stigma at the end of the pistil. That's the female part. And then the pollen will go down through a tube inside of the pistil called a pollen tube. And when it gets down to the bottom, you'll hit the ovary, and inside are little eggs. And so the sperm that's in the pollen will fertilize the eggs that are down in that ovary. And those fertilized eggs will grow into seeds that you can plant and grow a new plant. The ovary is what develops into the fruit. In this case, it would develop into the peas. And so Mendel used the pea plants because he could cross pollinate. So he could take pollen from like a tall plant and he could pollinate or put it on the stigma of a short. So he could see, okay, if I crossed a tall and a short, what am I going to get? So that's how we have parent plants. So you're looking at taking like the pollen or the sperm from one plant and then putting it on the stigma to fertilize the eggs of a different plant. We call this cross-pollination when you purposefully do that. So what he did is he said, okay, I'm going to cross a pure short plant and a pure tall plant. He called this the pea generation or the parent generation. And he made sure that they were tall, pure tall and pure short, because he would plant the seeds and then they all grew tall. He would take those and plant those. They all grew tall. He'd take those and plant those. They all grew tall. So if he knew that they continued to grow tall over and over and over, he called those pure tall. Same thing for short. So what he did is he took and went in and cut out all the stamens from the pure short plants. And so then he took the stamens from the pure short and he pollinated the pure tall. So he was crossing a pure short and a pure tall. And he had some ideas of what might happen, just like you would. He thought maybe some would be medium, or they would half would be tall and half would be short. What he discovered was that 3/4 of them grew tall, or no, excuse me, all of them grew tall and the short was gone. And that perplexed him because he was like, okay, what happened to the short? There were short plants. He kept thinking he should have got some of the plants short, but all of them grew tall. And so he started to call the tall ones the dominant, like they dominated over the short. They were more powerful. And he called the short recessive. Recessive meaning like weaker. And so the dominant overpowered the short, and we call it dominant and recessive for the stronger and the weaker. We have some more genetics humor for you. So now let's take a look at all of these vocabulary, because we're going to go back to Mendel's pea plants when we talk about some of this. We talked about traits, and those are physical characteristics of an organism. So things like tall and short, round and wrinkled, purple flowers and white flowers. So these are all these different characteristics. And Mendel didn't just do tall and short. That was the first experiment he did. He did lots of experiments over all these different, there were like 9 different traits that the pea plants had. Heredity, when we talk about something being like genetic or heredity, it's the passing of traits from the parent to the offspring. That's heredity. And when we study that passing of traits, we call that genetics. So the study of heredity is genetics. Genes, we already talked about little segments of DNA that control the traits. So it's just a few of the letters of the DNA that control a trait. That's called a gene. And then you can have different forms of the gene. So we said you could have the gene for long eyelashes or the gene for short eyelashes. So the gene would be the little segment of DNA that controls the length of the eyelash. An allele is a form of the gene. So you could have an allele for long eyelashes, or you could have the allele for short. So the allele is like the little code on the gene that tells you if it's going to be the dominant or the recessive, the long or the short, or if it's going to be like tall pea plants or short pea plants. Those are alleles. So alleles are the forms of the gene that give you the different types. If something is called purebred, it will always produce offspring with the same trait. So it's going to contain 2 identical alleles. In other words, both parents gave the exact same form of the gene. It could be, when we talked about Mendel and the tall, a pure tall plant would be the sperm had a gene for tall and the egg had a gene for tall. So the only genes that plant has, that seed has in it, would be for tall plants. The letters, big B, or little b, are representing the gene alleles. And the capital letters would be like big B, big B. That would be like you got two dominant gene alleles. So brown eyes are dominant. Big B would be purebred brown, meaning that you have a gene for brown eyes from your mom and you have a gene for brown eyes from your dad. Little b would be pure recessive. So blonde hair is recessive. So you could get a gene for blonde hair from mom and a gene for blonde hair from dad. And so you would be purebred recessive, and it would be little b, or lowercase, lowercase. And we'll keep practicing this if it seems like a lot. We talked about dominant and recessive. Dominant is a trait that will always show up when at least one dominant allele is present. So you only need one dominant gene and it will overpower the other recessive genes. So think of dominant as the more powerful. It overpowers the weaker recessive. So you can have brown hair if one parent gave you a brown hair gene allele and the other parent could give you a blonde hair gene allele. But because brown is dominant, it will overpower the blonde and you'll have brown hair. Recessive is the allele that gets covered up by the dominant. You're only going to see a recessive trait if all the alleles are recessive and there are no dominant alleles present. Think of recessive as being a weaker one. Blue eyes is recessive. So if you have blue eyes, all your genes for eye color are going to be blue. You have all recessives. There are no dominant genes there to overpower your recessive. A hybrid. Think of a hybrid car. If you don't know what a hybrid car is, it's a car that runs on electric and gas. So it's a combination of the two. Or if you've ever eaten hybrid corn on the cob, it's the corn that has some white kernels and some yellow kernels mixed together. So a hybrid is a combination of a dominant allele and a recessive allele. So a big B for let's say brown eyes and a little b for recessive blue eyes. Whenever you have a hybrid, the dominant will overpower the recessive, and the dominant trait is what's going to show up, and that's the one that you're going to see. We will say that you're still carrying a gene for those blue eyes. It's just being covered up by that dominant brown-eyed gene. But one day when you have children, your child could get a sperm or egg cell with that little b in it, and they could get that gene for blue eyes, even though you might have brown eyes. So some of you that say, well, I have blue eyes, but both my parents have brown eyes. Is that even possible? It is, because your parents are hybrids. And so what happens is their big B, they're for brown eyes, will overpower their little b for blue. But if both of them happen to give you that little b, that blue-eyed gene they were carrying, it gets expressed and it will show up in your eye color. Probability. So when we do these Punnett squares, and we'll talk about that, probability is the likelihood that an event will occur. You've probably worked with probabilities in math where you have to say, okay, what's the percent chance that something's going to happen? Same thing here in science. We're just looking at, okay, if this mom and this dad had children and these are the parents' genes, what is the likelihood or the percent chance that their kid is going to inherit that particular trait? A Punnett square is the chart that is going to show us all the possible combinations of gene alleles that could result from a genetic cross. So in this Punnett square that we're showing here, they're crossing a pure green pod, which is recessive because they're lowercase y's, with a hybrid yellow pod, which I know yellow is dominant because there's a capital Y and a lowercase y for green. So what they're doing is the Punnett square, you put one parent's genes on one side and the other parents on the other side, and then they're filling it out just to kind of show you what are all the possible ways that these genes could come together to make an offspring. Then you can look at all the possibilities and mathematically come up with a probability. So when I'm looking at all the possible ways that these genes could come together, it looks like 2 out of the 4 would be yellow because the big Y for yellow will overpower the little y for green. And 2 out of the 4 could be green. So it's a 50-50 chance that these parents would produce a child with yellow pods and a 50% chance they would produce a child with green pods. For Punnett squares, the genes for one parent will go on one side of the chart, as it's shown in the bottom right there, and the other parent's genes will go on the other side of the chart. So they're splitting up the genes on the side and the top. It doesn't matter which parent goes on which side, just make sure to keep the parent's two genes together. So if one parent is big G, then you got to keep those two G's together on the top. Or if you put them on the side, they would stay together on the side. To fill out a Punnett square, the letters along the top get pulled into the boxes, the two boxes below, and the letters on the side get pulled into the two boxes in that row. Kind of think of it like back in elementary school when you used multiplication tables and you had to take like 4 times 5 and you go over to 4 and down to 5, and where your fingers meet in the middle, that's the answer. What you're looking at here is they're just going to take that big A and drop it into the box below it, and then the box below that, and the big A on the side is going to come over straight across, and one will go there and the other in the far box. And so what you're doing is you're showing, okay, if let's say dad's genes are along the side. So let's say the big A from dad, if the sperm happened to get a big A and the egg from mom had a big A, the kid would have big A, big A. But if dad's sperm had a big A, but mom's egg had the little a, then it would be big A, little a. So they're just showing you all the ways that the sperm and egg could come together and what are all the possibilities that those parents could produce. Last bit of vocab. I told you there'd be a lot of vocab. A phenotype is an organism's physical appearance or what the trait looks like. For example, if you look at the picture, we have blue eyes and you have brown eyes. So what the trait looks like is called its phenotype. I remember it because PH for pheno, pH for physical appearance. So if you can remember, the pHs go together. A genotype is a little bit more specific. A genotype is an organism's genetic makeup or the actual allele combinations. So on a genotype, that's where you have to tell me the actual genes. So you're listing letters. Like that blue eyes, a genotype would be little b, because it's recessive. Or if you have brown eyes, you could be purebred brown eyes. You're pure, big B. Or you could have brown eyes and be a hybrid, which is a mix of one dominant and one recessive. But the dominant's more powerful, so it will overpower the weaker recessive. So you could be big B and still have brown eyes. So a phenotype is what it looks like, brown, blue. A genotype is more specific. Now I'm actually needing the letters to represent the gene alleles, so I know what are the actual genes that that person has. For a genotype, you need letters. Our last words, homozygous, heterozygous. The prefix homo means the same. I'm sure you can figure that out. Homo means same. So homozygous, same genes. This is an organism that has two identical alleles. So if it's homozygous, it's either big, so big B, or it could be lowercase, little b. The first would be homozygous dominant, all dominant genes. The second is homozygous recessive, all lowercase. So you can have homozygous and have it be dominant. You can also have homozygous and be recessive because homo just means the same, so the two letters are identical. Hetero means different. So if you're heterosexual, you like opposite sex. So hetero, different. In this case, heterozygous, different genes. So this is called a hybrid. It's kind of a synonym for the word hybrid, whereas homozygous is a synonym for purebred. Heterozygous would be one dominant and one recessive mixed together. And our final word, codominance. Codominance, if you have co in front of, like a co-captain or a co-CEO, it means that you are sharing the job of CEO. Co-captains, both are captains. So codominance is where you have two traits that are equally dominant. So the two alleles are sharing dominance, and they will both show up in the phenotype. So these alleles are neither dominant or recessive. They both appear in the phenotype. Parents with different phenotypes can produce an offspring with a third. So in the case of these chickens at the top, you can have a black chicken and a white chicken. And if it's codominant, the offspring will have black and white feathers. Blood type is an excellent example of codominance in humans because blood type A is dominant, blood type B is dominant. They share dominance, they're codominant. Blood type O is recessive, so A will overpower O and B will overpower O, but A and B together make up their own blood type, which is called type AB. And a little bit more genetics humor. Once you're done with your notes, make sure you submit them and then do some rounds of Quizlet. This will really help you with the vocabulary so that when you go to do the Mendel practice today, those vocabulary that you practiced on Quizlet, it'll be much easier to answer the questions. Leave your document open and use the document to answer the questions. Don't just guess, go back and look it up. Email me with any questions, and I'll be happy to get back with you.